In the shadowed world of occupied Europe during the Second World War, where British agents moved through cities under Nazi control using false identities and forged papers, survival often depended on what could not be seen. The Special Operations Executive, Britain's organisation dedicated to sabotage and subversion behind enemy lines, equipped its agents with an extraordinary array of concealed tools and weapons: compasses hidden in buttons, maps printed on silk handkerchiefs, explosives disguised as coal lumps, and escape kits sewn into the linings of clothing. But among all these ingenious devices, one item stood out for its stark simplicity and its terrible purpose. It was a knife so small it could be concealed almost anywhere on the human body, so thin it could be sewn into the lapel of a jacket and remain completely invisible, and so sharp that despite its diminutive size, it could kill a man in seconds if wielded correctly. It was issued to agents with explicit instructions that it was to be used only in the most desperate circumstances, when capture was imminent and all other options had been exhausted. It was the weapon of absolute last resort, the final tool that might make the difference between escape and execution, between freedom and torture. This was the SOE Lapel Knife, and this is the story of the smallest and most personal weapon of the Secret War, a blade measured in inches that represented the razor's edge between survival and death for the men and women who carried Britain's war into the heart of darkness. To understand why such a weapon was necessary, one must first understand the reality faced by SOE agents operating in occupied territory. These were men and women, British, French, Polish, Belgian, Dutch, and others, who were infiltrated into Nazi-controlled Europe by parachute, by submarine, or by crossing borders with forged documents. Their missions varied: organising resistance networks, conducting sabotage operations, gathering intelligence, training local fighters, and coordinating with partisan groups. But all of them shared one fundamental vulnerability. If their true identity was discovered, if their cover was blown, if they were captured by the Gestapo or the Abwehr or collaborationist police, they faced interrogation under torture and almost certain execution. The agents knew this. It was explained to them during training with brutal honesty, and they went anyway, because the war demanded it and because they believed the cause was worth the risk. SOE provided its agents with weapons and equipment suited to their missions. Pistols, usually small-caliber weapons like the Browning automatic or the Colt pocket pistol, were issued for self-defense. Larger weapons like submachine guns and explosives were cached or delivered for specific operations. But there was always the possibility that an agent might be caught in circumstances where conventional weapons were unavailable or had been confiscated. A random Gestapo checkpoint, a surprise search, an informer's betrayal could leave an agent suddenly in enemy hands with nothing but what they were wearing. It was for exactly these desperate situations that SOE developed a category of equipment known as escape and evasion tools, devices so small and so cleverly concealed that they might survive even a thorough search and provide one last chance at survival. The lapel knife emerged from this philosophy of layered contingency planning. It was designed at one of SOE's secret development facilities, most likely Station 9 at the Frith in Hertfordshire, or Station 12 at Aston House near Stevenage, where engineers and craftsmen worked on specialised equipment for clandestine operations. The design brief was extraordinarily specific. Create a knife small enough to be concealed in clothing, in a way that would survive all but the most invasive body searches, sharp enough to be effective despite its small size, simple enough to manufacture in quantity, and reliable enough that an agent could depend on it in a life-or-death situation. The result was a masterpiece of minimalist design, a weapon stripped of every unnecessary element until all that remained was the irreducible essence of what a knife must be. The SOE lapel knife measured approximately 2.5 inches in total length, with a blade of roughly 1.5 inches. Some variations were slightly larger or smaller, but all remained within this general size range. The blade itself was a simple flat piece of high-carbon steel ground to a sharp point and a double-edged cutting surface. There was no fancy shape, no serrations, no decorative elements whatsoever. The blade was essentially a narrow triangle of sharpened steel, functional and deadly. The handle, if it could be called such, was merely the continuation of the blade material, wrapped in thread or thin cord to provide minimal grip and prevent the user's hand from sliding forward onto the cutting edges. Some examples had a small guard to protect the fingers, others did not. The entire knife weighed less than an ounce and could easily be hidden in a closed fist. What made the lapel knife particularly ingenious was not the knife itself, but the method of concealment. The knife was designed to be sewn directly into clothing, typically into the lapel of a jacket or coat, though it could also be concealed in trouser seams, shirt collars, or the lining of garments. A small pocket would be created in the lining of the lapel using careful stitching that matched the existing construction of the garment so perfectly that even close visual inspection would reveal nothing unusual. The knife would be slipped into this pocket with just the very end of the handle exposed, held in place by a few threads that could be broken with a sharp tug. To an observer, even someone conducting a pat-down search, the lapel felt entirely normal. The knife added virtually no thickness to the fabric and created no suspicious shape. Only someone specifically looking for a concealed blade, feeling systematically for unusual rigidity in the garment, might detect its presence, and even then they would need to know what they were looking for. Alternative methods of concealment were equally clever. Some agents had lapel knives sewn into the waistbands of their trousers or skirts, positioned at the small of the back where they would be difficult to detect during a standing search. Others had them concealed in shoulder padding, in hat brims, or even in the thick seams of military-style boots. Female agents sometimes had them sewn into the lining of brasiers or the waistbands of undergarments, locations that male searchers in the conservative societies of the 1940s were less likely to thoroughly search. The principle in every case was the same. The knife had to be accessible to the agent with a single motion if needed, but invisible and undetectable to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Training agents to use the lapel knife was a delicate and psychologically demanding process. SOE instructors had to teach techniques for employing a weapon that was, by any conventional measure, inadequate. The blade was too short for slashing attacks, too small to reliably incapacitate an opponent with a single strike to the body, and required close contact that put the user at enormous risk. What the lapel knife could do, if used correctly, was kill or severely disable through strikes to specific vulnerable points on the human body. Instructors taught agents to target the carotid artery in the neck, the subclavian artery beneath the collarbone, the radial artery in the wrist, and most critically, the throat itself. A properly executed attack with even this tiny blade against the throat could sever the windpipe and major blood vessels, incapacitating a victim within seconds and causing death within minutes. But teaching the physical techniques was the easier part of the training. The psychological preparation was far more challenging. Instructors had to prepare agents for the reality that using the lapel knife meant getting close enough to their target to touch them, to feel their breath, to look into their eyes. It meant accepting that this was not combat at distance with firearms or grenades, but intimate violence of the most personal kind. It meant being willing to kill with your hands, to feel the blade enter flesh, to hold on as the victim struggled, to maintain control and purpose while another human being fought for their life against you. Not everyone could do this. Some agents, no matter how brave or committed, simply could not reconcile themselves to this level of intimate violence. For those who could, the training provided not just technique but psychological preparation for one of the most difficult things one human being can do to another. The scenarios in which an agent might use the lapel knife were taught as part of SOE's escape and evasion curriculum. The most common scenario was capture and interrogation. If an agent was taken into custody, searched and held in a cell or interrogation room, the lapel knife concealed in clothing might be their last remaining asset. The opportunity to use it might come during transport from one location to another, when guards were less vigilant. It might come during interrogation itself, if the agent could maneuver close enough to their interrogator to strike. It might come in a cell, if a guard came close enough during inspection, or when delivering food. The knife offered no guarantee of escape, but it offered possibility where otherwise there would be none. Another scenario involved checkpoint searches or random document inspections. If an agent was stopped by German military or police and their papers were questioned, they might find themselves being searched or ordered into custody. The critical seconds before being placed in restraints might be the only opportunity to act. A guard standing too close, focused on examining documents, might not see the hand moving to the lapel, the subtle motion of extracting the blade, and the sudden strike that would give the agent perhaps a few seconds to run, to disappear into a crowd or an alley, to escape immediate capture. The success rate of such desperate actions was certainly low, but the alternative was capture, torture, and death. The documentation surrounding actual operational use of the lapel knife is, predictably sparse and fragmentary. SOE's files were heavily culled after the war, with many sensitive documents destroyed to protect agents who survived and to maintain operational security about techniques and methods. What remains are hints and indirect references, accounts that mention agents carrying concealed blades without specifying details, and the occasional declassified report that refers obliquely to escape attempts involving close-quarters violence. We know that lapel knives were manufactured in significant numbers, certainly thousands, suggesting widespread issue. We know they were included in the standard escape and evasion kits provided to many agents. But specific confirmed instances of their use in the field remain largely classified or lost to history. There are, however, accounts from SOE veterans that provide glimpses into the knife's role. One former agent, interviewed decades after the war, described carrying a lapel knife sewn into his jacket during his entire time in occupied France, a period of over a year. He never had occasion to use it, but he knew it was there, and that knowledge provided a psychological comfort in the darkest moments. The knife represented agency, however limited. It meant that even if everything else went wrong, even if he was captured and stripped of all other resources, he would still have one option remaining. Whether he would have actually used it if the moment came, he admitted honestly that he did not know. But having it mattered. Another account, from a resistance fighter who worked with SOE in Belgium, describes being given a lapel knife by a British liaison officer with instructions on its concealment and use. The resistance fighter later used the knife not against a German but against a collaborator who had infiltrated their network and was about to betray them to the Gestapo. The action took place in a safe house, in silence, and the body was disposed of in a way that left no evidence pointing to the resistance network. This was not combat as traditionally understood, but the grim necessities of survival in an environment where betrayal meant death for entire networks of people. The lapel knife had served its purpose as a last resort weapon, though not in the circumstances its designers had primarily envisioned. The ethical dimensions of a weapon specifically designed for concealment and surprise attack troubled some within SOE and the broader British intelligence community. There were those who argued that equipping agents with concealed lethal weapons violated conventions of warfare and put agents at risk of being treated as assassins rather than combatants if captured. Others countered that agents operating in civilian clothing behind enemy lines were already outside the protections of conventional military law, that the Germans would show no mercy regardless of what weapons the agents carried, and that providing every possible tool for survival was not just justified, but morally required. These debates were never fully resolved, reflecting the moral ambiguities inherent in clandestine warfare. The manufacturing of lapel knives was carried out by small workshops under contract to SOE, using craftsmen skilled in blade making and metalwork. The knives had to be made to precise specifications to ensure reliability, but they also had to be produced quickly and in relative secrecy. Records suggest that several different manufacturers produced lapel knives, resulting in minor variations in design and finish. Some examples were beautifully crafted, with perfectly ground blades and careful attention to detail. Others were cruder, clearly made quickly to meet urgent demand. All were functional, which was what mattered. The simplicity of the design meant that even hastily made examples were generally reliable and effective. Distribution of lapel knives extended beyond SOE agents to other organizations and groups. The Special Air Service and other commando units received them as part of escape and evasion kits for personnel operating behind enemy lines. Resistance networks across occupied Europe received them through SOE supply drops and clandestine deliveries. Allied aircrew, particularly those flying bombing missions over occupied territory, were sometimes issued concealed knives as part of their escape kits, though these were often slightly different designs optimized for different concealment methods. The proliferation of these devices across multiple organizations and theaters indicates how widely the need for last resort concealed weapons was recognized. The post-war fate of most lapel knives is unknown. Many were presumably discarded or lost during the chaos of the war's final stages and the immediate post-war period. Some agents who survived the war may have kept their knives as personal mementos, though they were officially required to return all SOE equipment. Others were collected and destroyed as part of the systematic disposal of SOE's classified equipment in the years after 1945. Today, surviving examples of authentic SOE lapel knives are extremely rare and valuable, sought after by collectors of military and intelligence artifacts. Museums that possess examples typically display them as part of larger exhibitions about SOE and clandestine warfare, where they attract fascinated attention from visitors who are struck by the knife's tiny size and its dark purpose. The lapel knife represents something essential about the nature of clandestine warfare and the psychology of those who engage in it. It is a weapon that embodies the acceptance of worst-case scenarios, a physical manifestation of contingency planning taken to its logical extreme. Carrying a lapel knife meant acknowledging that you might find yourself in a situation so desperate that this tiny blade would be your last and only resource. It meant accepting that you might have to kill with your hands, at close range, to preserve your life or your mission. Not everyone could make that acceptance, and not everyone who made it in training could follow through when the moment came. But for those who could, the knife provided a sliver of agency in circumstances designed to strip away all agency and control. The design philosophy behind the lapel knife influenced subsequent generations of concealed weapons and escape tools. Modern military and intelligence services continue to develop miniature blades and tools for personnel at risk of capture, though contemporary materials and manufacturing techniques allow for more sophisticated designs than were possible in the 1940s. The principle remains the same: provide individuals operating in hostile environments with tools so small and so cleverly concealed that they might survive search and provide one last option when all others have been exhausted. The lapel knife was an early and remarkably successful expression of this principle. The psychological impact of carrying such a weapon is something that veterans have struggled to articulate. Several former SOE agents who discussed their experiences decades later tried to explain what it felt like to know that a lethal weapon was sewn into your clothing, constantly present but invisible, a secret that had to be maintained even in your own mind lest some unconscious gesture or expression betray its presence. Some described a peculiar comfort in the knife's presence, a feeling that they were not entirely helpless no matter what happened. Others described it as a burden, a constant reminder of the violent death they might have to inflict or might suffer themselves. The knife was both insurance and omen, promise and threat, tool and symbol. The historical significance of the lapel knife lies not in any decisive impact on the course of the war, but in what it reveals about the totality of the clandestine struggle and the depth of preparation that SOE invested in its agents. The existence of such a weapon demonstrates that British intelligence was thinking through every possible scenario, preparing for every contingency, no matter how grim or unlikely. It shows that they understood the realities of clandestine operations with clear-eyed brutality, and were willing to provide their agents with whatever might help them survive, even weapons that pushed the boundaries of conventional military ethics. The lapel knife was part of a larger philosophy: never send someone into danger without giving them every possible tool for survival, even if some of those tools were uncomfortable to contemplate. For the men and women who carried these tiny blades into occupied Europe, the lapel knife was a reminder of both the gravity of their mission and the fragility of their position. They were operating in an environment where a single mistake, a moment of bad luck, or a traitor's whisper could mean capture and death. The knife could not protect them from most of the dangers they faced. It could not stop a Gestapo raid or defeat an informer's betrayal. But it might, just possibly, provide one final opportunity when everything else had failed. That possibility, however remote, was worth the weight of the small blade concealed in their clothing. The stories of individual agents who carried lapel knives are mostly lost to history, buried in destroyed files and protected by the silence of those who survived. We do not know how many agents actually used their concealed knives in desperate attempts at escape. We do not know how many succeeded and how many failed. We do not know how many agents went to their deaths with a lapel knife still sewn into their clothing, a last resort they never had the opportunity to employ. These unknowns are frustrating to historians, but they are also appropriate. The lapel knife was a weapon of the shadows, used in circumstances so desperate and so personal that they were never meant to be public. Its history is necessarily incomplete because much of what happened in the Secret War remains secret still. What we can know with certainty is that the lapel knife represented a particular approach to the challenges of clandestine warfare, an approach that combined engineering ingenuity with unflinching acceptance of harsh realities. It was designed by people who understood that agents in the field would face situations where conventional weapons and tactics would be useless, where survival would depend on resourcefulness, determination, and the availability of tools that others had not anticipated. The knife was one such tool, and while we cannot quantify its contribution to the war effort in conventional terms, we can recognize that for the agents who carried it, it represented something irreplaceable. Hope in the form of a sharpened blade, agency measured in inches of steel, and the knowledge that someone had thought carefully about their survival and provided whatever might help. Today, when we look at surviving examples of the SOE lapel knife in museum displays, what strikes most viewers is the shocking disproportion between the knife's tiny size and its deadly purpose. It seems almost absurd that something so small could be considered a weapon at all, let alone a weapon of last resort for trained agents operating in mortal danger. But that initial reaction gives way to a deeper understanding when one considers the circumstances of its intended use. Size is irrelevant when the blade is pressed against a human throat. The engineering challenge was not making the knife large, but making it small enough to hide while remaining sharp enough to kill. In that specific and terrible requirement, the lapel knife succeeded perfectly. The legacy of the lapel knife extends beyond its direct operational use to its place in the larger story of SOE and the Secret War. It stands alongside the exploding rats, the disguised wireless sets, the forged documents, and all the other tools of the clandestine trade as evidence of the extraordinary lengths to which Britain went to wage war in the shadows. It reminds us that World War II was not only fought by vast armies and air forces, but also by individuals operating alone or in small groups behind enemy lines, using whatever weapons they could conceal and whatever courage they could summon to resist tyranny in its heartland. For these individuals, the smallest weapon could be the most important, because it might be the only one available when the moment came to fight or die. The lapel knife was never celebrated in the way that tanks or aircraft or famous battles were celebrated. There were no propaganda posters featuring this tiny blade, no newsreels showing its manufacture, no public recognition of the desperate circumstances in which it was meant to be used. Its existence was classified during the war and remained largely unknown for decades afterward. Even today, it is a footnote in most histories of SOE, mentioned briefly if at all in accounts that focus on more dramatic weapons and operations. But for those who study the details of clandestine warfare, the lapel knife holds a particular fascination precisely because it is so stark in its purpose and so honest in its acknowledgement of worst-case scenarios. The final assessment of the SOE lapel knife must be that it was exactly what it was designed to be, a weapon of absolute last resort, a tool for survival when survival seemed impossible, and a symbol of the determination to provide agents with every possible resource for staying alive in circumstances of extraordinary danger. It saved some lives. We can be certain of that even if the specific cases remain classified. It provided psychological comfort to many more, a tangible reminder that they had not been sent into the dark entirely unarmed. And it stands now as one of the most unusual and thought-provoking artifacts of the Secret War, a blade measured in inches that represents the razor's edge between freedom and captivity, between life and death, between hope and despair. In the hands of a desperate agent in occupied Europe, with all other options exhausted and capture looming, this tiny knife might have meant everything, and that, in the end, is why it mattered.